The year was 1894, and in the vast, wind-scoured emptiness of the eastern Colorado plains, Elias Thorne was engaged in an act that his neighbors considered the final, sorrowful proof of a mind unhinged by grief. He was not building a new barn to replace the one lost to a summer squall, nor was he digging a deeper well in preparation for the inevitable winter drought. Instead, with his two young children, Caleb and Anna, watching from a safe distance, Elias was building his house. A small, sturdy timber cabin, not on the open prairie where a house belonged, but inside the cavernous stone and mortar shell of the abandoned grain silo that stood like a forgotten monument on the western edge of his property. It was a relic from a more optimistic time, a failed communal venture from a decade prior, its thick walls now home only to swallows' nests and the high, lonely sound of the wind. Elias worked with a quiet, unhurried deliberation that infuriated those who wished to pity him and puzzled those who still held him in some regard. He was a widower of less than a year, his wife Martha having been taken by a fever that had swept through the territory with the merciless speed of a prairie fire. The community had expected him to falter, to perhaps sell his claim and take his children back east. They did not expect this strange, silent industry. He dismantled the old, dilapidated lean-to attached to his existing sod house, salvaging every usable plank and nail. He spent days inside the silo, sweeping out a decade of accumulated dust, bird droppings, and chaff, the rhythmic scrape of his broom echoing from the curved walls. He laid a new floor of thick, planed boards over a bed of dry sand, creating a perfect circle of clean, pale wood in the center of the silo's immense footprint. It was upon this foundation that he began to raise the frame of a cabin so small it seemed like a child's plaything within the silo's colossal embrace. It was Hiram Poole, a man whose opinions carried the weight of 2 successful decades of farming this unforgiving land, who first came to voice the community's collective concern. He rode up one afternoon, his horse's hooves muffled by the thick prairie grass, and sat in his saddle for a long time, watching Elias hoist a timber into place. Finally, he dismounted and walked to the wide, arched opening of the silo, his shadow falling long across the dusty ground. "Elias," he said, his voice a low rumble that was nonetheless swallowed by the strange acoustics of the place. "What is the meaning of this foolishness?" Elias, perched on a ladder, paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked down at Hiram, his face calm, showing no surprise or irritation. "I'm building our winter house, Hiram." Hiram Poole stepped inside, his boots crunching on the loose gravel near the entrance. He looked up, tracing the immense, curving height of the stone walls to the circle of blue sky visible through the open roof. He then looked at the diminutive wooden frame Elias was erecting. "Inside this tomb?" he asked, the word hanging in the still, cool air. "Son, the damp will settle in these walls. It will rot your wood and chill your bones. There's no light. In the deep of winter, this place will be colder than a grave. Stone draws the frost, you know that. It will be an ice house." He spoke with the unshakable certainty of a man who had survived by adhering to the known and the proven. His logic was sound, built upon the shared experience of every settler on that plain. You built with wood for warmth and sod for insulation, and you built where the sun could find you. You did not entomb yourself in stone. Elias descended the ladder, his movements measured. He respected Hiram, as all men did, but he did not fear his judgment. "The stone doesn't draw the cold, Hiram," he explained, his voice even. "It holds it, yes, but it will also hold the warmth once it's given." He gestured to the small, square frame. This cabin is the house. It will have its own walls, its own insulation. The silo is just a shield. It is a wall against the wind." Hiram shook his head, a slow, sad gesture of dismissal. "The wind is the least of your worries when the air itself freezes. You are making a mistake, Elias, a terrible, grief-addled mistake. Your children need a proper home, not this fantasy." He looked at young Caleb, who was stacking small pieces of scrap wood with a seriousness that mirrored his father's, and his expression softened with pity. "Think of the boy. Think of little Anna." He turned and left without another word, the community's verdict delivered. The whispers followed Hiram's visit, spreading from homestead to homestead like tumbleweeds in a gale. Dorothea Weiss, whose tongue was as sharp as her butter churn, was busy, declared that poor Elias Thorne had finally cracked. "He's building a nest in a bottle," she told a gathering at the general store. "Thinks he's a bird, maybe. It's the loneliness. It eats a man from the inside out." Others were kinder, attributing his actions to a desperate, misguided attempt to protect his family, a project born of fear and love, however foolish its execution. They saw a man clinging to the physical act of labor as a way to keep from drowning in his loss. Amusement was a safer position than concern, and so the silo house became a local curiosity, a landmark of sorrowful eccentricity. Men would sometimes ride out of their way on their journey to town just to catch a glimpse of the strange project, shaking their heads before continuing on their way. Elias heard the whispers. He saw the pitying glances, but they did not touch him. His resolve was not built on pride or stubbornness, but on a principle he understood as surely as he understood the arc of the sun. It was a knowledge passed down from his father, a man who had not been a farmer, but a master stonemason in the old country, a builder of cathedrals and grand public works. Elias remembered standing as a boy, his hand pressed against the immense granite wall of a church his father was helping to restore. It was a hot summer day, and the air shimmered with heat, but the stone was cool, almost cold to the touch. "You feel that, son?" his father had said, his voice thick with a foreign accent. "This stone, it drank the cool of the night. It holds it deep inside while the sun beats down. In the winter, it is the same. It will drink the heat from the fires we build inside, and it will hold that warmth, breathing it back at us long after the embers have died. Stone has a long memory for temperature. Wood is a quick friend, warm to the touch, but it forgets the fire as soon as it's out. Stone is a slow friend. It takes a long time to warm to you, but once it does, it will not forsake you in the cold." This was the principle, thermal mass. His father had never used those words, but he had taught Elias the truth of them. He had explained how the great stone ovens in the community bakehouse could cook bread for hours with only a single firing of wood, their thick brick walls radiating a steady, even heat. He had shown Elias how the stone-lined cellars kept milk from spoiling in August and potatoes from freezing in January. Watching an outcome is not the same as understanding the principle. His neighbors saw that stone was cold to the touch in winter and concluded that it was a source of cold. Elias understood that the stone was simply a vast, empty vessel for temperature, and that its nature was to resist change. It took an enormous amount of energy to cool it down, and an equally enormous amount to warm it up. The ferocious, ever-present wind of the plains was the true enemy. It was a thief, constantly stripping away precious heat from the thin wooden walls of their cabins, forcing them to burn through their wood piles at an alarming rate. A conventional house fought the wind and always, in some measure, lost. Elias was not building a house to fight the wind. He was building a house where the wind did not exist. He had tried to explain it once more, to Hiram, sketching a diagram in the dirt with a stick. He drew a large circle for the silo, and a small square inside it for the cabin. "The wind hits this outer wall," he said, drawing arrows that deflected off the silo's curve. "It can howl all it wants. It will never touch the cabin itself. The air in here," he pointed to the space between the two structures, "will be still. That stillness is the first and best insulation. Then, the cabin itself is insulated, and the stove inside will heat the cabin, but some of that warmth will escape, and slowly, day by day, it will warm the air in this gap. And that warm, still air will slowly heat the inner face of these stone walls. It might take weeks, but eventually, this whole silo will become a reservoir of mild heat, a buffer against the outside. The cold will have to fight its way through 2 feet of stone, then a pocket of still air, then the insulated walls of the cabin itself." Hiram had looked at the drawing, then at Elias, his expression unchanged. "It's a clever drawing, Elias, but it's just lines in the dirt. I'll stick with what I know works." The work continued through the shortening days of autumn. The methodical process became the rhythm of his life, a tangible counterpoint to the formless ache of his grief. He built the cabin with the salvaged wood, each plank a ghost of its former life. The walls were not thick, but they were carefully joined, every crack sealed. He did not have glass for a proper window, so he fashioned a single heavy shuttered opening that faced the silo's main door, hoping to catch the winter sun's low-angled light. The true insulation came from the earth itself. He spent a week digging dense, clay-rich sod from the banks of the creek, cutting it into uniform blocks. He packed this sod between the outer and inner planks of the cabin walls, creating a dense, earthen barrier nearly a foot thick. It was back-breaking labor. By nightfall, his muscles screamed with fatigue. But it was a clean, honest pain that pushed aside the other, more complicated kind. He felt he was building not just a shelter, but a fortress of pure reason. The children became part of the process. Caleb, at 7, was old enough to be a helper. He learned to mix daubing from clay, water, and dried grass, pressing it into the seams of the sod walls with his small hands. He carried tools and sorted nails, his small face a mask of concentration. Anna, barely 5, had the task of gathering stones, not large ones, but fist-sized river stones, worn smooth by the water. Elias was building the heart of his creation, the stove. It was a small, squat affair he constructed himself from scavenged sheet iron and fire bricks he had painstakingly chipped from a collapsed chimney on an abandoned claim. He based its design on the iron stoves he'd seen on ships, built for maximum efficiency and minimal fuel consumption. Anna's smooth stones were used to line the interior base, not just for protection, but because, as his father had taught him, they would absorb and radiate heat long after the fire was banked. The final, most crucial piece was the flue. He painstakingly riveted sections of stovepipe together, creating a narrow metal chimney that rose straight up from the stove, through the cabin's ceiling, and ascended 40 feet into the open air at the top of the silo, a thin black line against the curving gray stone. By the first week of November, it was done. From the outside, the silo looked exactly as it always had, a derelict stone tower. But inside, nestled in its core, sat the small, stout cabin, looking like a seed in a stone pod. The space between the cabin walls and the silo wall was a gap of some 10 feet on all sides, a strange, circular corridor of still, shadowed air. Elias moved their few possessions from the old soddy into the new dwelling. 2 beds, a small table, a chest of drawers, and Martha's rocking chair, which he placed near the stove. The first night they slept there, the air was cold and carried the raw smells of fresh-cut wood and damp earth. A profound silence pressed in on them, the familiar shriek of the prairie wind reduced to a distant, hollow moan that seemed to come from another world. Anna was frightened by the oppressive quiet, and Elias had to light a lantern and show her the solid walls of their little room, then walk her out into the cavernous space beyond to touch the cold, solid stone of the silo. "We are in the heart of the mountain," he told her, a story to soothe her fears. "And no storm can reach us here." The cold came gradually at first, a series of hardening frosts that turned the prairie grass from gold to a brittle, silvery gray. Elias began to use the stove, maintaining a small, disciplined fire. He did not try to heat the cabin to a sweat-inducing temperature. His goal was not immediate comfort, but the slow, methodical charging of the great thermal battery that surrounded them. Each day, he burned a precise, measured amount of the cottonwood he had spent the summer cutting and splitting. He was teaching the stone his father's lesson. He would go out into the silo's air gap and press his bare hand against the curving wall. For the first week, it was like touching a block of ice. Then, after 10 days of his steady, modest fires, the aggressive, heat-leaching cold of the stone began to recede. It was not warm, not even cool. It had become neutral. It had absorbed enough latent heat to rise from the temperature of the frozen earth to the temperature of the still, protected air within the silo. This, he knew, was the turning point. The test arrived in the second week of December. It came not as a dramatic blizzard at first, but as a change in the quality of the light. The sky took on a strange, milky, yellowish hue, and the wind, for the first time in memory, fell completely silent. The air grew unnaturally still and heavy. Hiram Poole, riding past on his way back from town, stopped his wagon. "Blue norther comin', Elias," he called out, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "The old-timers say this is the sign. It'll be a bad one. You get those children out of that icebox and come stay with us. My wife won't hear otherwise." Elias thanked him for the offer, but politely refused. "We'll be fine, Hiram. This is what it was built for." Hiram shook his head one last time, a look of genuine sorrow on his face, and clucked his horse into motion, the wagon wheels creaking loudly in the profound silence. That night, the temperature began to drop. It did not fall, it plummeted, as if the bottom had fallen out of the world. Elias watched the thermometer he had hung outside the main silo door. 20 degrees. 10. 0. By midnight, the mercury was huddled at 20 below, and the wind had returned, not as a gust, but as a solid, unceasing wall of force that screamed out of the north. The old soddy, which he now used for storage, groaned under the assault. He could hear, even through the silo walls, the high-pitched shriek of the wind tearing at its roof. He checked on the children. They were sleeping soundly under their wool blankets, their breathing even and untroubled. The air inside the cabin was cool, but not cold. There were no drafts. The little stove glowed with a dull cherry-red heat, consuming its fuel with a steady, quiet efficiency. For 3 days, the world outside ceased to exist. The blizzard was absolute, a maelstrom of ice and wind that erased the horizon and buried the landscape under a deep, suffocating blanket of white. The sound was a constant, deafening roar, a physical pressure that seemed to vibrate in the bones. But inside the silo, the storm was a distant rumor. The monstrous roar of the wind was transformed by the thick stone walls into a deep, resonant hum, like a giant tuning fork struck miles away. Inside the cabin, it was quieter still, the sound barely a whisper. Elias tended the fire, fed the children, and told them stories. He read to them from the one book they owned, his voice a calm and steady presence in their small, warm world. This was the period of faith. He could not see the outcome. He could only trust the principle. He moved through his tasks with a serene confidence, his faith not in a prayer, but in the predictable, immutable laws of the physical world his father had taught him to see. On the morning of the third day, he decided to perform the final test of his theory. He told Caleb to watch the stove, to add one small log if the embers began to dull. He put on his heaviest coat, hat, and gloves, and stepped out of the cabin's warmth into the still, dim air of the silo's interior. The air here was significantly colder, but it was motionless. There was no wind chill, no biting edge. He walked to the silo's inner wall and placed his bare palm flat against the stone. The shock of cold he had felt weeks ago was gone. The stone felt cool, like the wall of a deep cellar. It was not giving warmth, but it was no longer stealing it. It had reached equilibrium. It was a shield that had become a bulwark. He then walked to the great wooden door of the silo. Frost had crawled through the cracks, painting intricate ferns of ice on the interior planks. He pressed his ear to the wood and listened to the storm. It was a living thing, a ravenous beast of pure kinetic violence, and it was only inches away. A profound sense of quiet, unassailable triumph settled over him. He returned to the cabin. The children were playing a quiet game with carved wooden animals on the floor. Anna looked up at him and smiled, her cheeks rosy. Caleb was watching the fire, his expression serious. There was no shivering, no huddling for warmth. The simple, sensory proof was all around him. In the calm, quiet air, in the steady, radiant heat from the small stove, in the untroubled sleep of his children through the worst storm in a decade. He sat down in Martha's rocking chair and felt the truth of it settle into his bones. He had not conquered the storm. He had simply rendered it irrelevant. He had built a small island of calm in the midst of chaos, not through force, but through understanding. He thought of his father's hands, broad and calloused, resting on the ancient, cool stone of that church wall, and he understood that the man had passed on to him a legacy far more valuable than land or money. He had passed on a way of seeing the world, not as it appeared, but as it truly worked. The blizzard broke on the 5th day. The wind died, and a brilliant, painful sunlight flooded the world, reflecting off a sea of endless white. The silence that followed was as profound as the storm's roar had been. Drifts were piled to the eaves of the old soddy, and in some places, the snow was over 10 feet deep. It was another full day before Elias could tunnel his way out of the silo's main door. The landscape was utterly transformed, a smooth, undulating desert of snow. He could see no smoke from any of his neighbors' chimneys. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He spent the morning ensuring his few animals in the small, sheltered lean-to he'd built against the silo were safe, and then he began the arduous task of clearing a path. Late that afternoon, he saw a figure moving slowly across the snow from the direction of the Pool homestead. It was Hiram, struggling through the deep drifts on snowshoes, his face covered in ice, his movements slow with exhaustion. He stumbled toward the silo, a figure of grim determination. He clearly expected the worst, assuming Elias's silence meant tragedy. He reached the cleared area in front of the silo door and leaned against the frame, breathing hard, his shoulders slumped. "Elias," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "Thank God. I saw no smoke. I feared." Elias opened the door wider. "We are well, Hiram. Come in out of the cold." Hiram staggered inside, blinking in the dim light, and then he stopped. He stood in the middle of the silo floor, looking at the small cabin. He saw Caleb and Anna sitting at the table, eating bowls of warm stew. He saw the small, efficient stove, a thin trail of smoke rising placidly from its flue. He felt the air. It was not the biting, lethal cold of the outside. It was still, calm and cool, but palpably, miraculously, above freezing. Elias beckoned him into the cabin itself. As Hiram crossed the threshold, a wave of gentle, radiant warmth enveloped him. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a cabin with a roaring fire, but a deep, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He took off his gloves, his fingers numb, and held his hands out toward the stove. He stood there for a long time without speaking, simply absorbing the profound, impossible peace of the small room. He looked at the healthy, untroubled faces of the children. He looked at Elias, whose calm demeanor was not that of a man who had narrowly survived an ordeal, but of one who had been patiently waiting for it to pass. Finally, Hiram turned, his gaze sweeping over the sturdy, insulated walls, the well-built stove, the quiet domesticity of the scene. He looked at Elias, and the certainty, the pity, the gentle condescension were all gone from his eyes, replaced by a look of stunned, absolute respect. He walked back out into the air gap, and, mimicking an action he must have seen Elias perform 100 times, he placed his palm flat against the massive stone wall of the silo. His expression was one of pure bafflement. He could not reconcile what his senses were telling him with a lifetime of experience. He turned back to Elias, his mouth opened, then closed. He cleared his throat. I have never, he began, then stopped. He took a deep breath of the warm, still air inside the cabin. The wind, we could hear it tearing the shingles from the roof. We burned through a week's worth of wood in 2 days just to keep the frost from the inside of the walls. My wife and I, we barely slept. He looked at Elias, his eyes clear and direct. I was wrong, Elias, he said, the words simple, unadorned, and heavy with the weight of a fundamental truth being acknowledged. I don't understand it, but I was wrong. This place, it is the warmest house in the territory. That admission was the beginning of a shift, not just for Elias, but for the whole community. In the weeks that followed, as the territory dug out and counted its losses, livestock frozen in the fields, homes damaged, precious wood piles exhausted, the story of the Thorn silo began to spread. It was no longer a tale of a madman's folly, but of a miracle of survival. Hiram Poole, a man whose word was as good as currency, became Elias's greatest advocate. He did not pretend to understand the principle, but he described the proof with unwavering conviction. He told of the quiet, the pervading warmth, the healthy children. He brought others to see it, and they too stood in stunned silence, feeling the impossible reality of the place. Elias, in his quiet way, began to share his knowledge. He did not boast or gloat. When asked, he explained his father's wisdom. He drew his diagrams in the dirt again, but this time men leaned in to study them, asking questions, tracing the lines with their fingers. He explained the long, slow process of warming the stone, the critical importance of the still air gap, the efficiency of a small, well-designed stove. He taught them to see the wind not as an enemy to be fought, but as a force to be sidestepped. He showed them how to think about heat not as a fleeting comfort, but as something to be stored and saved, like grain in a silo. The silo house became a permanent fixture, a testament to a different kind of wisdom. Elias and his children lived there for many more winters, warm and secure against the worst the plains could throw at them. The design was copied and adapted. Settlers with stone-walled root cellars began to see them in a new light. New homes were built with a thorn wall, a thick, insulated stone wall facing the south to absorb the winter sun, holding its warmth long into the night. The abandoned silo, once a symbol of failure, and then of one man's grief-stricken folly, became a landmark of ingenuity and resilience. Decades later, long after Elias Thorne was gone, his grandchildren would still shelter in the small cabin within the great stone walls, telling the story of the ancestor who, armed with a quiet faith in a simple principle, had built a fortress of warmth in the heart of the cold, and taught a whole community how to listen to the wisdom of stone.